It started with a bold move that Canada thought would protect its future. But instead, it set off one of the biggest economic storms the country had seen in years. In late 2024, Ottawa decided to take on China by placing a massive 100% tariff on electric vehicles imported from there. The message was clear. Canada wanted to stop cheap Chinese EVs from flooding its market and crushing local automakers. Prime Minister Mark Carney said it was about fairness, a way to level the playing field for companies like Magna, GM Canada, and others trying to keep up in the global EV race. At first, it looked like a win. The stock market jumped, the headlines were full of praise, and workers in Ontario's factories felt a wave of hope. Canada's auto industry, worth nearly $80 billion, finally seemed protected. Politicians called it energy independence. But as every Canadian knows, good news here never lasts long. Within weeks, the excitement started to fade. By early 2025, the first cracks appeared. Across the prairies, farmers began hearing troubling whispers. China, one of Canada's biggest buyers of crops like canola and peas, wasn't happy. Beijing called the move protectionism and warned of consequences, and it didn't take long for those consequences to arrive. In February 2025, China hit back hard. It placed massive tariffs on Canadian agriculture, nearly 76% on canola, and a staggering 670% on peas and other crops. Overnight, the markets froze. Shipments that were headed to China were stopped, contracts were canceled, and the price of canola futures dropped more than 20%. For farmers in Saskatchewan and Alberta, it felt like the floor had been pulled out from under them. One farmer near Regina said it best: "We're sitting on mountains of grain and no one to sell it to." It was devastating. Canada's canola industry is worth about $40 billion, supporting more than 200,000 jobs. In just a few weeks, that entire system was under threat. Companies halted purchases, exports stalled at ports, and the Canadian dollar slipped to 71 cents USD. The damage didn't stay in the fields. It began to ripple through the whole economy. By March, the anger in rural Canada had turned into action. Thousands of farmers took to the streets, driving their tractors into cities and blocking highways. They carried signs that said things like, "Protect food, not votes." These weren't just protests, they were cries for help. Farmers had been told that the EV tariffs were temporary, a short-term pain for long-term gain. But all they saw now was loss. Prime Minister Mark Carney, once praised for being calm and capable, suddenly looked cornered. His government started using softer language, calling the tariffs flexible instead of firm. But it was too late. Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe made a bold move. He decided to fly to Beijing on his own to try to fix things. Ottawa was furious, accusing him of undermining national policy. But out west, he became a hero. People felt that finally, someone was standing up for them. Meanwhile, the economic pain spread to other parts of the country. The EV market, which the government had tried so hard to protect, began to crumble. Sales of electric cars dropped by 40% in just 6 months. Prices went up by almost $8,000, making EVs unaffordable for many families. In British Columbia, the provincial government even canceled its EV rebate program, saying it couldn't afford it anymore. Quebec tried to keep its rebate, but it pushed the province into a $300 million deficit. Across the country, factories slowed down, battery projects were paused, and hundreds of skilled workers were suddenly out of jobs. The dream of a green economy was fading fast. Even people who believed in the clean energy future started to wonder if Canada had moved too fast or fought the wrong battle. And the divide within the country kept growing. Out west, farmers blamed Ottawa for choosing to protect Ontario's car factories instead of their fields. In Ontario, factory workers argued that without strong manufacturing, there wouldn't be a Canadian economy at all. It was the old East-West divide reborn, but now it was fueled by real fear. Families in the prairies were losing farms, while in the cities, auto workers worried their jobs could be next. The financial system began to feel the strain too. Farm debt climbed as banks reported more missed payments. Equipment dealers saw sales drop by almost a third. Communities that had been built on decades of hard work were now barely holding on. Economists started comparing it to America's 2018 trade war with China, a fight that ended with billions lost and no real winners. Then, just when it seemed like things couldn't get worse, the US decided to jump in. In mid-2025, President Donald Trump announced a 35% tariff on all Canadian goods, from steel and lumber to medicine and aluminum. It was supposed to protect American workers, but it ended up hurting both sides. Canada lost nearly $50 billion in exports within months. U.S. companies relying on Canadian materials saw prices skyrocket. Home builders in Florida and Texas watched lumber costs jump more than 25%. Hospitals faced shortages of essential medications that came from Canadian suppliers. And it wasn't just trade that froze, it was travel too. Canadian tourism to the U.S. fell by over 30%. Border towns that once thrived on weekend visitors suddenly went quiet. Restaurants, hotels, and shops across New York and Michigan started closing their doors. People began calling it the loudest silence in North America. Mexico, on the other hand, took advantage. U.S.-Mexico trade rose 6% as American companies shifted south to fill the gap left by Canada. But for millions of workers on both sides of the U.S.-Canada border, that was cold comfort. Back in Ottawa, Carney faced the toughest choice of his career: keep the tariffs and risk total economic collapse, or pull back and risk looking weak. Behind closed doors, his team came up with a possible way out, a compromise. The idea was to cut the tariffs by about half, allowing some Chinese EVs back into the market, but only in exchange for something real. Under the deal, Chinese automakers would invest $3 to $5 billion in building new EV factories and battery plants in Canada, creating thousands of jobs. In return, China would reopen its doors to Canadian canola, bringing back billions in lost export revenue for prairie farmers. Some people called it smart, others called it surrender. But for most Canadians, it finally felt like balance, a way to protect both farms and factories without choosing one over the other. Economists said it could boost Canada's GDP by almost 0.5% and help stabilize prices again. When Carney stood before Parliament to explain his decision, he summed it up with one line that hit home: "We can't protect growth by isolating ourselves from it." It was a quiet admission that Canada had learned a hard lesson, that shutting the world out doesn't make you stronger, it just makes you lonely. By the time the dust settled, the damage was clear. The tariffs had bought time, but they had also destroyed trust between farmers and the government, between Canada and its partners, even between neighbors. But they also forced the country to face an uncomfortable truth. In a global economy, isolation doesn't work. And so, as Canada began to rebuild its trade ties and restart its EV industry, one big question still hung in the air. Would it learn from this storm, or repeat the same mistakes that brought it there? Because in the end, it wasn't just about tariffs or cars or crops. It was about balance. The balance between protection and progress. Between standing up for yourself and standing with the world.